Hi there, my name is Jace Tunnell and I'm going to be talking to you about Nurdles and Nurdle Patrol. We've been doing a lot of things over this last year and a half to be able to look at concentrations of pellets that are washing up on the beach. And so it'll be live so that you can look in the comment section and ask me questions, and I'll be in the background being able to type and answer some of those questions as we go along. So the Nurdles are actually small, tiny plastic pellets. They're lentil size, and they're the basis for everything plastic. And so they make these small bits of plastic, and then they ship them all around the world. Then they're melted down, added color, and then make into everyday products that you know of. So the glasses that you wear, your car, your computer, anything plastic was first that little Nurdle. And there's a couple of different types of plastic. So anybody that recycles, you see that circle of arrows and that has a number in the middle. Well, that number tells you what type of plastic that item is. And so it goes from 1 to 7. And so the Nurdles that we're finding that are washing up on the beach are actually the 4s and the 5s. So the low density polyethylene are the number 4s, and then the polypropylene are the 5s. And so I'm going to go through and tell you a little bit about how they get into the environment and what some of those impacts are. So how they're released into the environment are, well, of course, they make them on site at a facility, and then to be able to get those to an area that can actually make it into a product, they have to be shipped. And so there's a number of different ways that they ship these things. They ship them by railroad. They can also ship them in a truck. Then they can also put them in bags and put them in containers, and then put them on ships and then go all over the world. And then once they get there, then they have to offload them and then put them into different areas to be able to melt them down and make them to actual product. But what we're finding is, with the data that's come in, is that the majority of the highest concentration of pellets we're actually finding on by the manufacturing sites. And I'll show you some of that data with maps and things like that, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But then another area where we've been finding them is along railroads. And so why would we find them along railroads that aren't even by a manufacturing site? Well, as the rail cars are going down the railroads, these things are dripping out all along the way. And so at almost every railroad that we've sampled that, we found pellets at them. So what happens once these things actually get onto the ground? Well, as you know, anything that floats, when it rains, it gets picked up and then is carried out through the stormwater to the nearest water body. So once, say, with these silos, they hook up to the tube to the rail car, blow these things in. If some fall on the ground, it rains, then it gets into the stormwater, then out into, say, the nearest creek or waterway, bay, bayou, any of that. Then it gets washed out into the ocean and then back up onto the beaches. So that's why we find them in the beaches. We find them in the rivers and different waterways and places like that. And then less likely things that happen are whenever there's a big spill from a ship. So there'll be a big storm or something like that. The containers will go overboard, break open, and you'll just have billions of Nurdles that are streaming out. And so that's the less likely thing that'll happen. This has been a problem for decades. And so the EPA actually came out with a report in 1992 that compiled a lot of scientific reports that had been done in the late 80s and early 90s. And they looked at what species were eating these pellets, what the impacts of those pellets were on those species, how these pellets were getting into the environment, where some of the highest concentrations were around the United States, and then what some of the recommended solutions are. And so this report's actually available online. You can look up the 1992 EPA report, Plastic Pellets in the Aquatic Environment. Sources and recommendations. That's the full title. But one of the things that's in there, and on my presentation here you'll see there's a black and white photo, and that's an intestinal tract of a bird, and there's probably about 10 different pellets inside of there. And so most likely what happens is when these animals eat these pellets, they probably just pass them through, unless they eat a bunch of them at one time, or if they clog an intestinal tract. So there's no nutritional value to these, so the animal could actually starve to death. And then these things, when they're in the environment, they can actually absorb harmful chemicals that are in the water column. So you hear some of these acronyms like PCBs, DDTs, PAHs, things like that, those things, you don't want them on your skin. You definitely don't want to eat them and things like that. And so they would be the same for animals. You don't want the animals eating these. And so there hasn't been a link yet to those chemicals getting into the muscle tissue of, say, like a fish that we're eating. But there's a lot of studies and stuff that are going on right now looking at that. And so we have the technology now to where we'll be able to know that answer probably within the next few years. And then aesthetics, you don't like to see these on the beach. And so what are some of the issues on the beach is, say if there's a spill on the beach, I consider it very much like an oil spill where it's time sensitive. So you've got to be able to get to the beach, clean it up whenever it's at the first high tide line where these are concentrated. Because what happens over time? Well, the tides get higher, and it spreads the pellets across the beach. We do maintenance on the beach anywhere where there's tourism. In most states, they have a way to be able to clean the beach, and so it's either scraping, grading, raking, things like that. And so that further spreads out where these pellets would go. And then we have these natural forces like the wind picking up and blowing these things around. The wind also blows the sand around, so it could cover them up. So it's very much like an oil spill to where it's time sensitive to clean these up. And so state agencies need to be prepared in how they're going to deal with this when there's a big spill. So kind of why we started looking at this was that there was a Nurdle spill in September of 2018. And so we had called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard ended up calling the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality to come out and take samples and look at it. And then a couple days later, the state had called back and said that they weren't going to pursue it because they didn't know. First, they hadn't had to deal with it before, but second is they didn't know who the responsible party was, and most likely it happened offshore or it happened in another country or something. And so they weren't going to do anything about it. And so, which is understandable to think that it could have been from offshore. We know from studies that have been done that in this area of Texas, the Texas coastal bend, that we have 10 times the amount of trash on our beaches than we do in other states in the Gulf of Mexico, just because of the way the currents work. And so if you look at the Yucatan Peninsula and the loop current that goes around that ends up in the Gulf Stream, you get these eddies that wash off of that. And so large amounts of trash do come from all over the world and push up on our beaches. But so we wanted to know how long those pellets from that spill were going to be on the beach and how far they've spread. And so we started up this Facebook page called Nurdle Patrol, and we were asked for volunteers to be able to go out, spend 10 minutes, and once they find their first pellet, count for 10 minutes of how many pellets they found, and then put them into a database at nurdlepatrol.org. And then that way we could see where the highest concentrations of pellets were, so that we could see how long these pellets were around, how far they spread, and where possibly these things are coming from. And it's pretty amazing at what we found out, and I'll show you here in a second. So we're finding all different types of pellets. And so lots of times when you go to the beach, the most common type of pellet that you will find will be this opaque or white colored round pellet. But they actually come in all different shapes and sizes. And the factories that make these can actually tell whether they made them or not based on the shape and size alone. They don't even need to do chemical analysis, although they can do chemical analysis to know this as well. But it's all proprietary, so only the company can tell you whether they made them or not. And how these things get their shape and size is based on the extrusion plate that they push the plastic through, and then it goes into a cold dip. When it comes out of that cold dip, it's chopped up, and so that plate makes it its size, and then when it gets chopped is another way that you can tell how it's gets its shape and things like that. Now, if you start looking at the data that's come in, this is an image of the entire United States, and the colors indicate the concentration of pellets that were found in a 10-minute period. And so the greens are 0, and then the yellows are 1 to 30, and then the warmer the colors get, the higher the concentration is. And so when you see the purples, those are the real high ones. And I'll zoom in here in a second and you'll be able to see some more of those purples. But what I want you to see here is, if you're just looking at the Gulf of Mexico, notice that in Florida there are a lot of greens. And then as you go west, you start getting into the yellows, which is 1 to 30s. And then you start seeing higher and higher concentrations. And as I zoom in here, you'll see more and more. But the highest concentrations that we're finding are up in Galveston Bay, and that's where the highest concentrations of pellet manufacturing are in the Gulf of Mexico. And so if you put a map here of where the manufacturing facilities are around the Gulf of Mexico, this map would match up almost exactly of where those manufacturing sites are. Okay. Or where the highest concentration of pellets are. Now, another thing this map is good for, and this is from nurdlepatrol.org, and so it's like a Google Earth type platform. You can zoom into it, you can print up your own maps, you can see where there isn't data, where you think there ought to be. You can go to those sites and go collect your own data. So if you see here that there's data in your city that hasn't been collected, then you can go there and you can collect data, then you can zoom in, then you can print up your own map, then you can take this to your state agency or your elected officials and say, look, we have a problem here and we need to do something about it. And so I'm going to talk about some of those things that we can tell those elected officials and state agencies of what would be helpful in preventing these from getting out into the environment. So here's, if we zoom in just to the Gulf of Mexico, you can really start to see these sites a little more clearly. And the more you zoom in, the more you'll see, because what happens, since it's a Google Earth type platform, it's got to combine a lot of these together the further out you get. And as you go further in, these dots get smaller and smaller, and you can really see exactly where these data points were gathered. But what I want to show you here is that now that we're zoomed in a little more, you can see, like if you look at Texas, look, there's some of those that are inland, and you might be thinking, what are those for? Well, those were actually sites that were collected along railroad stations, or railroads. And so that tells you that this isn't just a coastal issue. These go anywhere there's a railroad that transports these pellets across the country, those pellets could be there. Now, this is South Carolina, and in Charleston, the Charleston Waterkeepers have done a really good job in going around and trying to find where these high concentrations of pellets are. And if you look at this site here, you can see they have the Atlantic Ocean, and they've sampled all along there. And then once you get up near Charleston, which is where they have a distributor up in there, they've actually been able to get a lot of different data points there. But it really goes to show you that you can hone in on where maybe these higher concentrations are to try to figure out where these things are coming from. So the highest concentrations of pellets that we're finding are actually up in Galveston Bay. Like I mentioned earlier, this is where the highest concentration of plastic manufacturing companies are in the Gulf of Mexico. And so you see a lot of these purples. A lot of those purples are over 1,000 pellets in a 10-minute period. And if I zoomed into some of these, and I'll do that here in a second, if you zoom in real close, you'll see a lot of different data points in some of these areas. And so the further you get up into the bay towards Houston, that's where you get into the ship channel, and that's where a lot of the manufacturing sites are. And that's where the highest concentration will be, on the beaches that are accessible. So here's one of those places, Morgan's Point. This is at the mouth of one of the main ship channel that comes out. And so this is there's volunteers that go out there, and they're able to sample. You know, we ask people to go out monthly if they can. So there's a lot of samples at this spot, but you can see that I've zoomed in so much that now the dots are individual. So you can see exactly where they had collected their data. And then if you click on a dot, it will tell you what the concentration was. It'll tell you how many volunteers there were collecting, how long they collected, when they collected, and then a little description in there. And so all the metadata is right here. So if anybody wants to go in and kind of look around in their area, they're able to do that with this tool. Now, we also came out with a publication. So we wanted this data to be scientifically valid, and for two reasons. One is researchers, if they're going to use the data from Nurdle Patrol, they like to know that the way it was collected was in a way that uses the scientific method and is valid. And then the other is in litigation. And so, you know, we're trying to figure out where these pellets are coming from. And so, you know, sometimes there's litigation that goes along with trying to prevent these pellets from getting into the environment. And so this document really helps. It's open source, so anybody can search this on the internet. They can pull it down. They can read it for free. There's no charge for that at all. So it's all open source. Now, one of the tables you'll see in there is the top 20 highest concentrations of pellets that were found whenever this document, the publication was written. And so you'll notice that every single one of the top 20 in this publication were from Texas. And so those, you can see the highest one is over 30,000 in a 10-minute period. And so I've been up to the Galveston area after a heavy rainfall and been to some of those beaches, and I could scoop up in the high tide line. Every single handful would have 250 pellets. And so you can imagine over a 10-minute period, there's a lot that you can pick up. And so there's a huge problem in that area. And so we're working with the state agency, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, gathering this data and giving it to them. And so hopefully they can create stricter stormwater permits, or language in their permits, which I'll show you here in a second. That's what our real hope is. Now, what's the latest data? So as of the end of March, the data that we have of March 2020 is we've have over 2,000 volunteers that have sent data in, over 5,300 surveys across the U.S., with the majority of those in the Gulf of Mexico, and at over 2,500 sites. And then we have 28 partner organizations. And so what we consider partner organizations are organizations that have given monetarily to the effort for Nurdle Patrol. They've donated items, or they have at least one person that's willing to go out at least once a month to do at least one survey. And so we've got a lot of partner organizations that have multiple people that are going out monthly to multiple different sites and sending data in. But to be a partner organization, you know, one person from an organization willing to go out monthly to collect data in their area. So if you'd like to be a partner, feel free to email me. My email will be on here at the end of this presentation, and I'll put it up here in the video so you'll be able to see that. So what can be done? Well, there is an Operation Clean Sweep that was done by the American Chemical Council. That was put together about 25 years ago, although it's only a voluntary program. And so there's a lot of good best management practices in there that companies can take. Actually, the state agencies could take these best management practices and make them mandatory in their stormwater permits. And so that's what we're kind of advocating for. There could be a database that links the Nurdles to the manufacturing site, so shape and size could be key, or the chemical composition of these pellets as well. And so that should be made available to the regulatory agencies, so that if there is a spill, you can actually tell how many different spills there were within that one site, and you can also trace it back to who made it. And it needs to be quick accountability by the plastic pellet industry. So stormwater permit language, this is pulled out of an application for a facility that Formosa that was going to, they said they were going to do 0 pellet discharge through their stormwater, which is key because currently the requirement is that there would be only a trace amount of suspended solids. That's what their permit says. So it doesn't even say plastic pellets. And so that's how a lot of these are across the country in multiple different states. I think California is the only state that has a requirement for a 0 pellet discharge. And so this is what all states need to go to. So I put this in here because this might be helpful if you're with an organization that's advocating for 0 pellet discharge from these plastic manufacturing. You could use this language. And then there needs to be a fine associated with any pellets that are found within their stormwater, because that's how we will see change. Now we've set up a couple of different resources for you. One, I mentioned this nurdlepatrol.org. That's where you can go. We've got news on there. We've got a 4-minute training video on the home page that will show you how to do a training, or that will show you how to actually go out and do a survey. And then there's also a link to Facebook page. And so Facebook's the other thing here. We've got over 2,000 people on the Facebook page, and they are posting pictures all the time about what they find and where they find it. Any news stories that comes out about plastics or plastic pellets and things like that, they're always adding that there. So it's a good way to stay in tune with other citizen scientists that are doing things there. Now, why are we doing all this? Why do we care if plastic pellets are being released into the environment? Well, these are my kids here. This is Jack and Parker. So they ought to be out, playing at the beach, counting birds, picking up seashells, things like that. Instead, they're picking up these plastic pellets. And so, we can do something about this now. This is our generation are the ones that cause this, and the previous generations, we don't need to be pushing this off to the next generation. Okay, so partner organizations. We've got the 28 partners. This is a list of them here. If you'd like to be added to that, feel free to send me an email, jace@utexas.edu, and we'll talk about how you can partner with us to be able to help find out where the pellets are coming from and to reduce these from getting out into the environment. Okay, appreciate your time. Thank you. Bye.